Steelers having already clinched the number 1 seed. So in this game, we had Mason Rudolph completing 18 of 20 passes for 152 yards and 1 touchdown. And for the Ravens, you had Tyler Huntley completing 15 of 28 passes for 146 yards and a touchdown. Then rushing the ball, you had Najee Harris getting 26 carries for 112 yards and a touchdown. And then Gus Edwards getting 10 carries for 48 yards. And finally, receiving the ball, there was Deontay Johnson, who had 4 catches for 89 yards and a score. And on the other half, you have Nelson Aguilar, who had 5 catches for 39 yards. Looking at the total offense in this game, the Steelers led the way. They had 289 total yards of offense to the 224 of Baltimore. Both teams were even in the turnover ratio with 2 turnovers each. And yeah, let's break down that offensive yardage. Passing the ball, the Steelers had the advantage with 134 passing yards to the 118 of the Ravens. But rushing the ball, the Steelers also had the advantage with 155 yards on the ground to the 106 of the Ravens. So in this game, offense was more in the Steelers' favor. Taking a look at the red zone coverage, you have the Steelers converting on 1 of their 2 attempts in the red zone, whereas the Ravens struck out. They were 0 of 1 in their red zone attempts. Penalty-wise, this game was pretty light for penalties for the Steelers and 3 penalties for the Ravens. As I mentioned, both teams, they had 2 turnovers. For both teams, it was a fumble lost. And taking a look at the sack battle, the Steelers allowed 3 sacks while the Ravens allowed 4. So, worse on offense, worse in the red zone, worse in the sack battle, and even in turnovers. So all these things led Baltimore to a loss here. Obviously, they were playing below their full strength, and the Steelers were operating with technically their A unit. Obviously, Kenny Pickett is their main quarterback, but they've been rolling with Rudolph, and they kept him, and they won this game. So good for the Steelers. They finish at 10-7. The Ravens finish at 13-4. And yeah, we'll dive right into the next matchup, which would be the Saturday night game between the Houston Texans and the Indianapolis Colts. Now, this is a very high-stakes matchup for both teams because they're both in a win-in-in situation. Whoever was winning this game was going to the playoffs, and whoever was losing was not going to be in the playoffs at all. And it was a very close matchup, but the Houston Texans walked away with a victory in the final moments, winning this game 23-19. So in this game, you had C.J. Stroud completing 20 of 26 passes for 264 yards and 2 touchdowns. So great game by him. And on the other half, you had Gardner Minshew completing 13 of 24 passes for 141 yards. Then rushing the ball, Devin Singletary had 24 carries for 63 yards and a touchdown. And for the Colts, you had Jonathan Taylor, who had 30 carries for 188 yards and a touchdown. And then receiving the ball, Nico Collins had an amazing day with 9 catches for 195 yards and a score. And then you had Josh Downs, who had 3 catches for 48 yards. So, surprisingly enough, if you look at the offensive output, you'll find that Houston was outgained by Indianapolis at a margin of 360 to 306. But the Colts turned the ball over once, and the Texans did not at all. Breaking down that offensive yardage, you'll find that the Texans had 246 yards through the air, whereas the Colts had 133. But the Texans only had 60 yards on the ground, whereas the Colts had 227. And then taking a look at the red zone stats, the Texans were 2 of 2 in the red zone, so very efficient. They punched it in when it mattered, whereas the Colts, even though they made it 3 times, they scored 0 touchdowns on those 3 attempts, so not a good day in the red zone. This was a very penalty-heavy Texans team. They suffered 11 penalties in this game, so it's actually quite impressive that they're still able to overcome it and win, whereas the Colts only allowed 3 penalties. And then in the sack game, the Texans allowed C.J. Stroud to be sacked twice, whereas the Colts allowed Gardner Minshew to be sacked once. So, yeah, at the end of the day, this game was determined by a 4-point margin. Obviously, the Colts gave up a turnover, which is critical in a close game like this. And really, it was right there. The Colts were maybe 25 yards away from scoring a touchdown to end the game. situation in which there's like a minute left in the game. They took a timeout, they called up the play, and it was Gardner Minshew. He dropped back into coverage. Granted, the Colts have been running the ball amazing all game. And yet they decided to put the fate of the team, the fate of the whole season, in Gardner Minshew's hands. And what happened was he threw a pass to T. Goodson. I think his name is Tyler. Some guy who has 6 catches the entire year. And he was open in the flat. Minshew caught him at the right time, threw the pass to him. But the pass was slightly late. It was slightly behind Goodson, so he had to try and spin around and catch it. And in the attempt to do it, he just wasn't able to grab a hold of the football, so he fell over, pass incomplete, and the Colts season was over. You could see in the fan base's reaction, a lot of them at first thought they got it and they converted. Had they converted, they probably would have won the game. Actually, at that time, it was 17-23. Later on, the Texans would intentionally allow a safety, basically, to run out time. But yeah, it looked like the Colts had the momentum. They had everything. But on 4th and 1, they turned away from Jonathan Taylor, who had been carrying them through the game, literally and figuratively. And yeah, it cost them. So a very nice season by both teams. No one expected either of them to be here. But the Texans, they get to walk into the playoffs, and the Colts get to walk home. So, moving into the Sunday slate, you had a matchup between the Cincinnati Bengals and the Cleveland Browns. Both teams operating with backups. The Browns decided to rest Joe Flacco, having already secured a playoff spot, and the Bengals were still rolling out with Jake Browning. The Bengals would go on to win this game 31-14. And in it, you had Jeff Driscoll playing quarterback for the Browns. He completed 13 passes for 166 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions, whereas Jake Browning completed 18 passes for 156 yards and 3 touchdowns, but also 1 interception. Then rushing the ball, Pierre Strong Jr. for the Browns had 14 carries for 65 yards, and Joe Mixon for the Bengals had 14 carries for 111 yards and a touchdown. Then receiving the ball, you had David Bell, who had 4 catches for 68 yards and 2 scores, whereas for the Bengals, the leading receiver was C. Jones. Then taking a look at the offensive output, Cincinnati led in this one by quite a bit, by 84 yards it seems. They had 328 yards of offense, whereas the Browns only had 244. The Browns also had 2 turnovers to the 1 of the Bengals. Breaking down that offensive output, you have 140 yards through the air for the Browns versus 145 for the Bengals, so almost even. But rushing the ball, the Browns only gained 104 yards to the 183 of the Bengals. And then in the red zone, there was no red zone for the Browns really. They went 0 times and they converted 0 times, whereas for the Bengals, they were unstoppable in the red zone in this game. They went 4 times and they scored on all 4 trips. Penalties was also a big margin of error for the Browns. They had 7 penalties to the 1 of the Bengals. So, kind of just in all aspects. Oh, and then in sacks, both teams had 3 sacks. So, pretty even in that category. But anywhere else, the Bengals just were superior to the Browns. So, a good walk-off victory for the Bengals. Obviously, they can't do anything with that. And for the Browns, they weren't playing for anything really. They were resting. So, yeah, that ends that. The Browns finish at 11-6, and the Bengals finish at 9-8. Then going into the next matchup, it was between the Minnesota Vikings and the Detroit Lions. Minnesota had a very slim chance of making the playoffs, even if they won this game. But that doesn't matter because ultimately they lost at a score of 30-20. In this game, Nick Mullins, very polarizing. He gets offense moving. Sometimes he gets the other team's offense moving as well. He completed 30 of 44 passes for 396 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions, whereas Jared Goff had 23 completions for 320 yards and 2 touchdowns. Then rushing the ball, Ty Chandler had 12 Vegas for 69 yards. David Montgomery had 10 carries for 40 yards and a score. And lastly, receiving the ball, you had a wonderful day from both leading receivers. Justin Jefferson finished with 12 catches for 192 yards and a touchdown. So, amazing game. And Amon-Ra St. Brown, also very nice, 7 catches for 144 yards and a score. Worth noting that neither of these guys made the Pro Bowl. Jefferson, obviously because of injury, and Amon-Ra St. Brown, one of the biggest snubs in the Pro Bowl this year, I would say. In offense, Minnesota actually surpassed Detroit in this one. They had 448 yards of offense to 381 of the Lions. But Minnesota also had 2 turnovers to the 0 of the Lions. Breaking that down, passing the ball, Minnesota had 359 yards through the air, whereas the Lions had 311. Rushing the ball, Minnesota also had 89 yards, whereas Detroit had 70. So in both ways, they were better. They just had poor ball security. Interestingly enough, as good as they were on offense, Minnesota only made the red zone one time, and they could not get it done on that one attempt, whereas Detroit went 3 of 4 in the red zone, so a more efficient day for them. Penalties-wise, the Vikings also suffered. They had 8 penalties, whereas the Lions had 4, and when it comes to sacks, the Vikings also suffered there. They had 4 sacks allowed to Mullins, whereas the Lions only allowed 1 sack. So, even though the offense did move the ball pretty well for the Vikings, sacks, penalties, and turnovers kept them from winning this one. So they lose by a final margin of 10 points. Then, moving into the next matchup, you have the Jacksonville Jaguars facing off against the Tennessee Titans. The Jaguars were playing with a playoff spot on the line, whereas the Titans weren't. And sadly for the Jaguars, they were not able to get a victory in this one. They lose this game 20-28. So the Jaguars will finish with a record of 9-8, and the Titans will finish with a record of 6-11. In this game, Trevor Lawrence finished. He passed 29 times for 280 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions, whereas Tannehill had 17 passes completed for 168 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Travis Etienne Jr. had 16 carries for 57 yards, whereas Derrick Henry had 19 carries for 153 yards and a score. Then receiving the ball, you had Calvin Ridley, who had 6 catches for 106 yards and a touchdown, whereas DeAndre Hopkins had 7 catches for 46 yards and a score. Offensively, the Jaguars actually outgained the Titans 362-327, but the Jags also had 2 turnovers to the 1 of the Titans. And then the breakdown of that offensive output, 280 of those yards for the Jaguars came through the air, whereas it was 152 for the Titans. And running the ball, it was very different. You had 82 yards on the ground for the Jags, whereas the Titans had 175 yards rushing. Taking a look at the red zone efficiency, this is really where the Jacksonville Jaguars struggled in this game. They went 1 of 3 on their red zone attempts, so the Titans defense did a good job of not allowing them to capitalize on their yardage, whereas the Titans went 3 of 3, and that was very instrumental in their victory. Then penalties, you had 6 penalties for the Jaguars, whereas only 5 for the Titans, but that's pretty similar. And the Jaguars actually did a good job of not letting the defenders get to Trevor Lawrence. He suffered 0 sacks in this game, whereas Ryan Tannehill was sacked twice. So, even though their offensive line did well, and they were able to pass the ball pretty well, they couldn't capitalize in the end zone. And one too many turnovers and just more penalties. So all these things prevented the Jaguars from clinching a playoff spot. And they lost this game. Very sad way for them to go out. They started off the season 8-3. They were red hot. They had beaten some good teams, but unfortunately they finish 9-8. So a tremendous breakdown for the Jaguars here. Very interested to see how they bounce back next year. But after that, you have a matchup between the New York Jets and the New England Patriots. This was a snow game. The Jets would walk away margin of 17-3. In this game, Trevor Siemian completed 8 of 20 passes for only 70 yards. And on the other hand, you had Bailey Zappi, who had completed 12 of 30 passes for 88 yards and 2 interceptions. So not a lot of passing in this game because the conditions just did not allow for it. Maybe also the quarterback play, but I think most of the conditions. Rushing the ball, Breece Hall had yet another electric day with 37 carries for 178 yards and a touchdown, whereas Ezekiel Elliott had 13 carries for 54 yards. And receiving the ball, not a spectacular day. You had Garrett Wilson finishing with 2 catches for 34 yards, and Jalen Reagor finishing with 1 catch for 33 yards. So, taking a look at the offensive output in this game, the Jets had 254 yards of offense, whereas New England only had 119. The Pats also had 2 turnovers to the 1 of the Jets. And of that offensive production, 69, after you account for sacks, there was 69 yards to the air for the Jets and 31 yards to the air for the Patriots. This is because the Jets allowed 1 sack to Trevor Siemian, but the Patriots allowed Zappi to be sacked 7 times. Then rushing the ball, the Jets clear advantage, 185 yards on the ground versus 88 yards on the ground for the Patriots. In terms of red zone, there was no red zone scoring in this game. The Jets went 0 of 2 and the Patriots went 0 of 1. The Patriots also lost the penalty battle for penalties to the 1 of the Jets. And as I said, turnovers, Patriots 2, 1 for the Jets. So, in every phase of this game, the Patriots were worse. But they win the Tank Bowl, they successfully lose this game, which guarantees their 4th overall pick, which to many fans is the true victory here. Had they won this game, it would have really put their draft spot up in jeopardy. So, good things for the Patriots. But unfortunately, they lose that streak of beating the Jets since 2015. So, the Jets, they have put their long streak of shame to rest, and they get to walk into the new year and at least be happy about one thing. Then moving into the next matchup, it was between the Atlanta Falcons and the New Orleans Saints. Both teams were playing with a chance to potentially make the playoffs. Both teams did need the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to lose that game in order to make the playoffs, though. So, or I don't know if the Saints needed it, but the Falcons definitely did. And so in this game, you eventually had the Saints winning with a final margin of victory of 48-17. They absolutely dominated in this one. Desmond Ridder finished with 22 passes for 291 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 score, whereas Derek Carr finished with 22 of 28 passes for 264 yards and 4 touchdowns. Bijan had 11 carries for 28 yards, whereas Kendre Miller had 13 carries for 73 yards and a touchdown. Then receiving the ball, Bijan was also the leading receiver with 7 catches for 103 yards and a touchdown, whereas Rashid Shaheed was the leading pass catcher for the Saints with 3 catches for 65 yards and a score. Offensively, honestly, it wasn't that far apart. You had New Orleans with 400 yards and Atlanta with 389, but the 3 turnovers for the Falcons really set them back in scoring points. Offensively, 311 yards to the air for the Falcons. How is that possible? I guess at one point Ridder was sat and they had someone else come in. Logan Woodside. I don't know who that guy is, but I guess he was throwing the ball around a little bit. So 311 yards through the air for the Falcons, whereas 246 for the Saints. But on the ground, 78 yards for the Falcons and 154 for the Saints. Red zone efficiency was pretty key in this one. The Falcons converted on 1 of their 3 attempts, whereas the Saints converted on 4 6 attempts, so they were in the red zone like the entire game. Penalties was also a pretty big factor. The Falcons had 8 penalties to the 3 of the Saints. Turnovers was huge. 3 turnovers for the Falcons, none for the Saints. And sacks. This is actually where the Falcons did better. They only allowed 1 sack, whereas the Saints allowed 3, but it was not enough. Obviously, lots of costly mistakes for the Falcons, and the Saints played a very clean game. Alright, then after that, you have a matchup between the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Carolina Panthers. The Buccaneers were playing with a playoff spot on the line. They needed to win this game, and they would be in. So a very easy situation for them. And luckily, they were able to manage, but not very impressively. The Buccaneers finished with a final score of 9-0 over the Panthers. So I guess they got what they wanted, but a very lousy game in my opinion. You had Baker Mayfield completing 20 passes for 137 yards, whereas Bryce Young finished with 11 passes for 94 yards. Rashad White had 19 carries for 75 yards, and Jabba Hubbard had 23 carries for 83 yards. Then receiving the ball, you had Chris Godwin finish with 6 catches for 51 yards, and DJ Chark, who had 2 catches for 46 yards. Tampa Bay led the way offensively in this disaster class. You had 228 yards to the 199 of Carolina. Carolina also had 2 turnovers in this game. I mean, it was pretty close, to be honest. 0-9 is not that bad of a loss. Bad if you're a viewer, but as the team who lost, it's more so embarrassing than it is like a beatdown. Passing the ball, Tampa Bay outpassed 115-68. But rushing the ball, the Panthers led the way with 131 yards to the 113 of the Buccaneers. No red zone conversions in this one. The Buccaneers finish 0-3, whereas the Panthers finish 0-0. Like, they never made it. Both teams had 3 penalties, and both teams allowed 3 sacks. So really, it was the 2 turnovers for the Panthers. Had they not turned the ball over in this game, who knows, maybe it would have finished 0-0. But yeah, not an exciting game at all. I truly apologize if you watched this game. Maybe it was entertaining, but from what I'm looking at, it doesn't seem like it. But yeah, the Buccaneers get the victory, and finishing at 9-8, they will make the playoffs, and the Panthers finished with the league worst 2-15 record. So not an ideal start to the Bryce Young era. After that, you have a game between the Chicago Bears and the Green Bay Packers. The Packers also playing in a win-and-in situation in this game, and luckily for them, they were able to get a victory. They finish with a final score of 17-9 over the Bears. Their overall record is 9-8 after that game, and the Bears finish at 7-10. In this game, Justin Fields completed 11 passes for 148 yards, whereas Jordan Love completed 27 passes for 316 yards and 2 touchdowns. Khalil Herbert led the ball for the Bears. He had 12 carries for 28 yards, so not a lot on the ground game, whereas Aaron Jones had 22 carries for 111 yards. Then receiving the ball, you had DJ Moore hauling in 4 passes for 64 yards, and Jaden Reed completing 4 catches for 112 yards. So in terms of offensive efficiency, the Bears were completely blown out in this one. They had 192 yards of offense, whereas Green Bay had 432. So yeah, not very close. Green Bay did have 1 more turnover than the Bears, 1-0, but it didn't really matter at all because they were so productive on offense. Breaking down that offensive efficiency, the Packers had 308 yards through the air, whereas the Bears only had 117. The Packers also had 124 yards on the ground to the 75 of the Bears. In terms of red zone efficiency, the Bears went 0-2, whereas the Packers went 2-4, so 2 more touchdowns. And then very, very clean game. Both teams only incurred 1 penalty in this one, so that's kind of what you want to see. Good job to both teams in that regard. And 1 turnover for the Packers, but it proved to be not that costly. And in terms of sacks, this is also where the Bears really struggled. They allowed Fields to be sacked 5 times, whereas Jordan Love was only sacked once. So, sacks and, yeah, just poor offense, really. You played mistake-free football. You didn't have any penalties, really, but sacks and inability to punch the ball in when it mattered is what cost it for the Bears. Once again, the Packers get to make the playoffs, and the Bears, they weren't really playing for anything except spoiler. So, yeah, the Packers' ownership of the Bear, that narrative extends, but really, other than that, nothing lost for the Bears. After that, you have a matchup between the Denver Broncos and the Las Vegas Raiders. Both teams not really playing for anything except for pride. In this one, the Raiders would walk away with a victory with a final score of 27-14. Jarrett Stidham completed 20 of 34 passes for 272 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception, whereas Aiden O'Connell completed 20 of 31 passes for 244 yards and 2 touchdowns. Javonte Williams had 9 carries for 32 yards and a score in this one, whereas Samir White, who got the start for an injured Josh Jacobs yet again, he had 25 carries for 112 yards. Then you had B. Johnson leading the way for the Broncos with 4 catches for 88 yards, and Trey Tucker catching the ball 5 times for 79 yards for the Raiders. Offensively, the Raiders led by a decent amount in this one, finishing with 359 yards to the 286 of the Broncos. The Broncos also suffered 1 turnover in this game. Looking at the passing breakdown, you had 238 yards through the air for the Broncos versus 230 for the Raiders. And rushing the ball, the Broncos only had 48 yards on the ground, whereas the Raiders had 129, so that helped them quite a bit. The Broncos were actually quite efficient in the red zone in this game. They went 2 of 2, whereas the Raiders went 2 of 3. But the Broncos suffered 4 penalties to the 0 of the Raiders. That's honestly very impressive. You don't see a lot of teams having a 0 penalty game, so hats off to the Raiders for accomplishing that. And yeah, once again, there was 1 turnover for the Broncos. And taking a look at the sacks, Stidham was sacked 5 times, whereas O'Connell was sacked 3. So, turnovers, sacks, and not that many penalties, but enough to set the Broncos back. And yeah, the Raiders, they walk away with a victory in this one. So, we'll see if Antonio Pierce gets to keep his job. I would say hopefully he does. I don't want the Raiders repeating the same incident with Rich Bisaccia. I feel like he was a fan favorite. He was a player favorite. Everyone liked him. He did such a good job after taking over the team. And for some reason, they handed the keys over to Josh McDaniels, so no one wants to see that happen again. You finish the year on a good note. Just give him the head coaching position. And yeah. So, after that, you have the Giants beating the Eagles. The Eagles were playing with a chance to reclaim the title of the NFC East in this one with a victory and a Cowboys loss, but obviously that did not occur. So the Philadelphia Eagles finish at 11-6 this season after starting 9-1, and the Giants finish at 6-11. In this game, Jalen Hurts very unfortunately had a gruesome injury to his finger. It popped out, and so hoping that he is okay. Obviously, you never want to see players go down with injury. So Marcus Mariota led the way for the Eagles in this one with 13 passes for 148 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. Whereas for the Giants, you had Tyrod Taylor completing 23 of 32 passes for 297 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. You also had Kenneth Gainwell getting 7 carries for 62 yards, and Saquon Barkley getting 18 carries for only 46 yards, but 2 touchdowns. Then Quez Watkins led the way for the Eagles with 8 catches for 93 yards and a score, whereas Wan'Dale Robinson led the way for the Giants with 5 catches for 85 yards. In this one, the Eagles actually were behind in offensive output without their leader, Jalen Hurts. They finished with 299 yards out of offense, whereas the Giants put up 415, which is very respectable. The Eagles really got pounded when it came to the turnover battle. They had 4 turnovers in this game, whereas the Giants only had 1. bit more than the 109 for the Giants. But in terms of red zone efficiency, it was kind of tough for the Eagles in this one. They made it twice, and they converted once, which is 50%, but the Giants were also 50% with many more trips. The Giants made it to the red zone 6 times and converted 3 of those. 2 fumbles and 2 interceptions for the Eagles, whereas just 1 interception for the Giants. The Eagles had fewer penalties, but it was a pretty clean game. 2 penalties for the Eagles, 3 for the Giants. And the Eagles actually allowed 5 sacks to their quarterbacks in this one, whereas the Giants only allowed 2, which is very, very surprising. The Giants set the franchise and NFL history record for most sacks in a season, so pretty surprising that the Eagles, lead best O-line, allowed 5 sacks in this one. But yeah, Jalen Hurts getting injured, turnovers. It was too much for the Eagles to overcome. They finish in a very sloppy manner, to be honest. The Eagles started off very, very strong. They were the clear favorites for the NFC. They looked just as strong as when they made the Super Bowl, and really it all came crumbling down in the last few weeks. So we'll have to see how they do. Obviously, they still make the playoffs, but quite an unfortunate finish for this Eagles team. After that, you have the Seahawks, who are playing with their playoff position on the line. They battled against the Arizona Cardinals, and the Seahawks walk away with a very slim victory, finishing this game 21-20. In this game, Geno Smith completed 16 of 28 passes for 189 yards and 2 touchdowns, whereas Kyler Murray finished with 22 of 30 passes for 262 yards and a score. Kenneth Walker III had 17 carries for 78 yards, whereas James Conner had 27 carries for 150 yards and a touchdown. Then receiving the ball, you had Tyler Lockett, who had 2 catches for 71 yards and a touchdown, whereas Michael Wilson had 6 catches for 95 yards. Then, offensively, actually, Arizona outperformed Seattle by quite a bit in this one. Arizona had 466 yards of offense, whereas the Seattle Seahawks only had 327. No teams had a turnover in this game, which is very nice. But let's see why the Cardinals were not able to win it. This would come down to, first up, let's talk about their offensive breakdowns. The Cardinals had 260 yards through the air to 189 of the Seahawks, so advantage there. Then rushing the ball, the Seahawks had a pretty good day with 138 yards on the ground, but the Cardinals had an even better one with 206 rushing yards. So what went wrong? Sacks was a minor issue. No sacks allowed to the Seahawks, 1 sack allowed to the Cardinals. Red zone efficiency was dead even. You had 1 of 3 for both teams. And I guess it was penalties. The Seahawks, they were able to escape this game with no penalties at all, whereas the Cardinals had 5 penalties. And really speaking, I guess that's what did them in. Their 5 penalties set them back only 27 yards, which is not enough to negate all of the other offense that they were having. Truly do not know. I mean, obviously, the Seahawks in this game, it does seem like they went for a 2-point conversion. Let's see. When did they score? Yeah, Arizona was up 20-13 over the Seahawks in the 4th quarter with 2 minutes left in this game. The Seahawks scored the ball, and after that, they went for a 2-point conversion, and they converted. So they were able to pull off what the Lions were trying last week. And actually, yeah, it would have been the exact same score. So hats off to the Seahawks. They complete their 2-point conversion, and they keep their playoff hopes alive with that victory. Because they needed a victory in order to stay in the picture. The Seahawks finished with a record of 9-8, and the Cardinals finished with a record of 4-13. So then after that, you have a matchup between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Los Angeles Chargers. Very close game as well. The Chiefs would win this game 13-12. The Chiefs were resting their starters, and the Chargers are injured, so it isn't really not high stakes, not a very promising game if you're watching. Gabbert versus Easton Stick. Blaine Gabbert finishes with 15 passes for 154 yards and a touchdown, whereas Easton Stick completes 28 of 47 passes for 258 yards. L.B. Ryan had 21 carries for 76 yards for Kansas City, whereas Easton Stick had 13 carries for 77 yards. Pretty good day for Stick on the ground. And then receiving the ball, McCole Hardman had 6 catches for 77 yards. Haven't heard his name in a stat sheet in a while. And Donald Parham Jr. finished with 5 catches for 83 yards for the Chargers. Offensively, the Chargers actually were better in this game. They had 353 yards to the 268 of Kansas City, and both teams suffered 1 turnover. Through the air, the Chargers had 235 yards to the 145 of the Chiefs, and rushing the ball, it was very similar. 123 yards on the ground for the Chiefs, 118 yards on the ground for the Chargers. So what really happened? One issue was sacks. The Chargers allowed 3 sacks to the 1 of the Chiefs. And red zone jitters, I would say. It seems like the Chiefs, they made the red zone 1 time and they didn't score, but the Chargers made the red zone 3 times and they didn't score on any of them. And then on top of that, you have a defensive special team touchdown from the Chiefs, so they were helped out in scoring the points, whereas all the points came from the offense for the Chargers, but they were all field goals. So in a game that the Chargers very easily could have won, they walk away with a loss. I feel like that sums up the majority of their season. And the Chiefs win a rather meaningless game, but it helps their record look not as bad. So we move forward. After that, you had a matchup between the Rams and the Niners. Both teams resting their quarterbacks. So instead of Stafford versus Purdy, you had Carson Wentz versus Sam Darnold. The Rams, by the way, won this game 21-20. So the Rams finish with a record of 10-7, and the 49ers finished with a record of 12-5. Carson Wentz finished with 17 of 24 passing for 163 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception, whereas Sam Darnold finished with 16 of 26 passing, 189 yards, and 1 touchdown. Carson Wentz somehow turned back the clock. I wonder what this guy was doing in this game. He carried the ball 17 times. That is absurd. But 17 carries for 56 yards and a touchdown for Carson Wentz. So turn the wheels on in this game. Whereas Elijah Mitchell, an actual running back, only had 14 carries for 52 yards and a touchdown. Then receiving the ball, you had B. Hopkins with 2 catches for 47 yards and C. Conley with 3 catches for 69 yards. Offensively, the 49ers were actually superior in this game with 300 total yards to the 258 of the the Rams. And breaking that down, 149 of those yards came through the air for the Rams versus 175 for the 49ers. Then in the ground game, the Rams had 109 yards versus 125 for the Niners. So why did the Niners lose this game? Well, turnover battle was even, but oh my goodness, actually this was very promising game in the red zone. Both teams went 3 of 3 on red zone attempts, so no one struck out. They made it to the end and they accomplished their goals. But the reason why the Niners were not able to win it in this one seems like one is penalties, 5 penalties to the 2 of the Rams. After that, sacks, 2 sacks for the Rams versus 3 sacks allowed by the Niners. And it seems like the Rams did the exact same thing that the Seahawks did. San Francisco in the third quarter. Actually, San Francisco going into halftime was leading this game at 20-7. So the Rams were losing by 13 points. In the third quarter, they responded. They scored a touchdown, but they failed the point after attempt. And so they were losing 13-20. After that, they opted to, make up the point that they lost. And they converted the 2-point conversion. So rather than tying the game 20-20 going to Rams, they do what the Lions failed to do last week also, and they win this game 21-20. It's actually quite ridiculous how many games are ending in this debacle of the score being 19-20 and then going for a 2-point conversion. Like, they reused the script so many times in the last week, but it's entertaining. And yeah, the Rams win. After that, you have the Dallas Cowboys facing off against the Washington Commanders. The Cowboys needed to win this game in order to secure first place in the NFC East, and luckily for them, that's exactly what happened. They won this beatdown fair and square. Well, I didn't mean to say fair and square. Heftily is what I meant to say. But yeah, 38-10 was the final score. Dak Prescott finished 31 of 36 passes for 279 yards and 4 touchdowns, but 1 interception. Sam Howell finished with 19 of 27 passing with 153 yards, 1 touchdown, and 2 interceptions. After that, Tony Pollard had 17 carries for 70 yards and a touchdown, whereas Brian Robinson had 9 carries for 25 yards. Receiving the ball, another big day from CD. He had 19 catches for... What am I saying? He had 13 catches for 98 yards and 2 touchdowns, whereas Terry McLaurin had 6 catches for 56 yards. Offensively, it was a huge disparity in this one. Dallas had 440 yards of offense to the 180 for Washington. Washington also had 3 turnovers, and Dallas had 1. Not particularly close at all. Passing the ball 309 yards through the air for the Cowboys, 130 for the Commanders. Rushing the ball 131 yards for the Cowboys, only 50 for the Commanders. Then in the red zone, wow, the Cowboys really lived in the end zone in this game. They went 5 of 7 on red zone attempts, whereas the Commanders went 1 of 2. The Commanders also had 4 penalties to the 2 of the Cowboys. They had 3 turnovers to the 1 of the Cowboys, and they allowed 4 sacks, whereas the Cowboys allowed 0. So, overall, a very dominant performance from the Dallas Cowboys. They cap off a impressive season with a victory. And yeah, now we get to move into our final matchup of the week. This was the Buffalo Bills versus Miami Dolphins game. A lot on the line for the Bills in this one. They were facing a very interesting predicament where if they won the game, they would be the number 2 seed in the AFC, and if they lost the game, plus some other special circumstances, they could fall out of the playoff picture completely. So, yeah, lots on the line for the Bills. And for the Dolphins, if they win the 2 seed, then they win the game, they win the 2 seed. It was simple for them. But the Bills would go on to win this game 21-14. Josh Allen had 30 of 38 passing for 359 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions in this game, whereas Tua went 17 of 27 with 173 yards, 1 touchdown, and 2 interceptions. Josh Allen was also the leading rusher in this game with 15 carries for 67 yards, whereas Devon Achane was the leading rusher for the Dolphins with 10 carries for 56 yards and a touchdown. Then you had Khalil Shakir leading the way for the Bills with 6 catches for 105 yards, and Tyreek Hill leading the way for the Dolphins with 7 catches for 82 yards and a score. So offensively, the Bills were really ahead in this one by almost 200 yards of offense, 473 to 275 of Miami. The Bills did play a little bit of sloppy football with 3 turnovers, whereas only 2 for the Dolphins. Breaking down their offense, 345 yards to the air for the Bills, 167 for the Dolphins. Then you had 128 yards on the ground for the Bills, 108 for the Dolphins. In terms of red zone efficiency, the Dolphins were 1 of 1, which, I mean, I guess it's 100%, but you only made the red zone 1 time, whereas the Bills were 2 of 5, so they scored more touchdowns, but they were far less efficient, but they got there a lot. In terms of turnovers, bad game from the Bills, 3 turnovers, and being able to win a game is kind of impressive. The Bills did benefit, though, from a defensive special team touchdown in this game. In terms of penalties, the Bills were worse. They had 6 penalties penalties to the 4 of the Dolphins. And in terms of sacks, the Bills were also worse. They allowed 3 turnovers to the 1 of the Dolphins. So, it's not that often that you can be worse in the sack category, the turnover category, and the penalty category, and still walk away with a victory. So, I would say that the Bills, they played as well as they needed to. I wouldn't say that they played great. The Dolphins, on the other hand, they have a rather puzzling defeat. Their offense just wasn't doing it in this game. Alright, so with that, we have officially wrapped up the NFL 2023-2024 regular season. I hope you had fun. I know I sure had a lot of fun. I got to attend a game this season. And yeah, it was a nice run for all these teams. Great to see all the action play out. And we get to see what our Wildcard Weekend matchups are now that everything has been decided. So next weekend we begin the NFL playoffs. A very fun time to be a football fan, just a fan of the sport. So on Saturday, January 13th, we have our first matchup. This is a matchup between the 5th seed Cleveland Browns in the AFC against the 4th seed Houston Texans. This game will take place in Houston since they are the AFC South division leader. I can't say I expected these two teams for sure to make it into the playoffs, but that being said, I think this game could be a lot of fun. You've got the young CJ Stroud trying to get his first ever postseason victory. I mean, it's his first season ever, and he already made the playoffs, so big congrats to him. If he can add even more onto that, that would be extremely special. And for the Browns, they're being led by Joe Flacco. Let's see if his elite postseason performances can play on. He had that amazing run with the Ravens quite a few years ago. He's won a Super Bowl. We know he can do it, and he's been playing hot. So, very excited to see that matchup. After that, at 5, or I guess in Western Coast timing, at 5 p.m. on Saturday, we've got the Dolphins and the Chiefs. The Chiefs finish as the 4 seed, so they will be at home. Wait, actually, I don't know if they finish as the 4 seed. No, they must finish as the 3. And the Dolphins are the 6. Yeah, my bad. Or my mistake. So yeah, the 3 seed Chiefs are at home, and the 6 seed Dolphins are visiting. This is going to be Tyreek Hill's first return to Kansas City since being traded away from the Chiefs. So, highly anticipated matchup. Earlier in the season, Dolphins and Chiefs matched up, and that game was in Germany, I believe. The Chiefs got the better of the Dolphins in that game, so Tyreek Hill couldn't say too much, but he gets a shot at redemption with this one. The Chiefs, they look the most beatable that they have in the last few years, whereas the Dolphins, even though they're rising, they've been good these last 2 years offensively. They haven't had much success against winning teams, so there's a bit of personal rivalry here. There is just 2 high-powered teams. At least this year, Dolphins were high-powered on offense. The Chiefs historically are. They have a big history in the recent couple of years to back up their playoff success, but we'll see who walks away with victory in this one. After that, you've got the Sunday slate. There's 3 games on Sunday. The first of those is going to be another AFC matchup. It's the Steelers and the Bills. You've got the 7th seed Steelers visiting the 2 seed Buffalo Bills. It'll be interesting. The Bills, also a bit of a sloppy season. As I mentioned, it was down to the wire for the Bills. They only clinched the playoffs as of last week, but now they have home advantage almost all the way through, unless they have to face off against the Ravens. So yeah, they did themselves a favor, and the Steelers managed to crawl into it in the last couple of weeks, so a good stretch from them. We'll see how this plays out. But yeah, after that, start with the NFC playoff teams. The first is a nice matchup, It's at 1:30 Western time on Sunday between the Packers and the Cowboys. The Cowboys finish as the 2 seed in the NFC, and the Packers finish as the 7. So that'll be a fun game. The Packers, they strung together a nice couple of victories towards the end of the season to put it away and get into the playoffs, whereas the Cowboys, they managed to jump over the Eagles in their late stretch. So a very nice finish from both teams. The Packers in recent history have had a lot of soul-crushing victories over the Cowboys. So we'll see how the Cowboys fare in this one. Truly, if Jordan Love wants to live up to his Aaron Rodgers comparison, he just needs to win this on some last-second miraculous feat. And yeah, one thing to be noted is the Cowboys are undefeated at home this year, and unless they play against the 49ers, they will be at home. So yeah, obviously a very tough matchup, but should be fun. Then you've got another spectacular game. This is the Sunday night game. It is between the Rams, who finish as the 6 seed, and the 3-seeded Lions. This is a reunion of Matthew Stafford and Detroit. Obviously these two teams swapped quarterbacks just a few seasons ago. I believe it's been 3 seasons at this point. At first, the Lions looked like they had lost the trade just because Matthew Stafford goes on to win a Super Bowl very quickly after. And yeah, it was a great success story for them. But now, after 2 consistent seasons of pretty good offensive play, the Lions have made a name for themselves. They clinched their first division title, something that they were never able to do under Matthew Stafford, and now they get to face off against their old franchise quarterback. And then on the other hand, the Rams, they made a Super Bowl with Jared Goff. Let's not overlook that. Jared Goff has been playing very well this year. He's a big reason why the Lions were able to turn it around as well. So, big rivalry game. Both these quarterbacks facing their old teams, a lot on the line, a lot to prove, but the Lions do have home field advantage, so we'll see who gets the best of one another in this matchup. And lastly, we have a game on Monday, because Monday is Martin Luther King Jr. Day here in the U.S., so this is a matchup between the Eagles and the Buccaneers. To be honest, I'm glad they put this game on Monday. It's the one that I care the least about. It's the 4 seed versus the 5 seed. The Eagles have not ended the year in a spectacular fashion. Obviously, last week, Jalen Hurts injured his finger, so we'll see what the status is on that. On top of that, the Buccaneers, they managed to win out in a very weak NFC South, creeping into the playoffs at a record of 9-8. They obviously play at home, but a lot of people are going to be betting against them since the Eagles were on top. I would say this is the weakest of all the division leaders, but we'll see. Maybe they can shock the world. So, yeah, that is your Wildcard Weekend slate for the upcoming weekend. Let me know what you think, which game you're most excited for, and maybe least excited for, if there's one that you're willing to skip. And yeah, thanks for watching. If you enjoy content like this, feel free to like, comment, or subscribe. I'll be putting out more videos as the week progresses. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you